The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania farmland as Isaac Beiler stood at the edge of 20 acres he never expected to own. His estranged grandfather Samuel had been gone from their Amish community for 40 years, yet somehow he'd remembered Isaac in his will. The inheritance felt like a burden more than a blessing. Wild, overgrown land with nothing but an old limestone cave to mark its worth. Isaac had come to survey what needed clearing, but his 5-year-old niece Ruth had other plans. While he studied the tangled brush and sagging fence posts, she slipped away with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. Inside that, a cave, Ruth would discover something that would shake their quiet community to its foundation, draw families back together, and reveal why their ancestors had gone to such extraordinary lengths to preserve their past. But what could be so important that it was worth hiding for over a century? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Isaac Beiler had always been a man of few words, but those who knew him understood that his silence came from thoughtfulness rather than unfriendliness. At 43, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that marked the best of his community. Shoulders squared from years of honest labor, hands calloused, but gentle, and eyes that held both wisdom and sorrow. The sorrow came from losing his younger brother David in a farming accident 3 years prior, leaving behind little Ruth, who had become the light of Isaac's otherwise solitary existence. The Beiler farm stretched across 87 acres of some of the finest soil in Lancaster County, land that had been in their family for 6 generations. Isaac's great-great-grandfather had purchased it in 1847 with money earned from his blacksmithing skills, and each generation had improved upon what came before. The white farmhouse, built in 1892, stood proudly at the end of a gravel lane lined with maple trees that blazed orange and red each autumn. Behind it, the red barn housed 12 dairy cows, a handful of pigs, and the draft horses that still pulled Isaac's plow despite the modern world's encroachment on their simple way of life. Ruth had been barely 2 when David died, too young to fully understand death, but old enough to feel the absence of her father's laugh echoing through the house. Isaac had taken her in without question. It was what family did, what their faith demanded, and what his heart required. She was a spirited child with her father's curiosity and her late mother's gentle nature. Her mother, Emma, had passed during childbirth, leaving David to raise Ruth alone until the tractor accident that claimed his life as well. Now Ruth spent her days following Isaac through his morning chores, chattering about the chickens' personalities and naming each of the barn cats. She had an uncanny ability to find wonder in the smallest things. A butterfly landing on her prayer cap during church, the way sunlight made the cow's breath visible on cold mornings, or how the wind seemed to whisper secrets through the corn stalks. Isaac marveled at how she could transform his measured, routine existence into something filled with small discoveries. The inheritance from his grandfather Samuel had arrived as unexpectedly as a summer thunderstorm. Isaac remembered Samuel only vaguely from his childhood, a tall man with kind eyes who had been shunned by the community when Isaac was barely 7 years old. The reasons for Samuel's departure had never been clearly explained to the children, only that he had chosen worldly ways over their plain faith and could no longer remain among them. Bishop Miller, now in his 70s and the spiritual leader of their district, had been a young man when Samuel left. He remembered the division it had caused, families torn between loyalty to an old friend and adherence to the Ordnung, the unwritten rules that governed their community life. "Your grandfather was a good man who lost his way," the bishop had told Isaac when the inheritance papers arrived. "Perhaps God means for you to find peace with this burden he has left you." The 20 acres sat 3 miles northeast of Isaac's main property, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through a grove of ancient oak trees. Isaac had visited the land only once since learning of the inheritance 6 weeks ago, and what he'd found was discouraging. Decades of neglect had allowed the fields to return to wilderness. Brambles and wild grapevines choked what had once been pasture, and the old fence posts leaned at impossible angles, their wire tangled and rusted. At the far edge of the property, a limestone outcropping rose 15 feet from the ground, and carved into its base was the entrance to a cave that Samuel had mentioned in the brief letter accompanying his will. "The land remembers," Samuel had written in his careful script. "What our family buried there was meant to be found, but only when the time was right. I pray you will understand what I could not explain to your father." Isaac's father, Jacob, had refused to speak of Samuel after the shunning. The wound had run too deep, the sense of betrayal too complete. When letters arrived from Samuel over the years, always returned unopened, Jacob would simply shake his head and consign them to the fire. Isaac had grown up knowing he had a grandfather somewhere in the outside world, but that man might as well have been a stranger for all the connection they shared. The cave itself appeared unremarkable from the outside, a natural opening perhaps, 4 feet high and 6 feet wide, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of daylight. Isaac had brought a flashlight on his first visit, peering into the entrance but venturing no further. The space seemed to open into a larger chamber, but he had felt an odd reluctance to explore, as if he were trespassing on something sacred. Ruth, however, had no such reservations. On this crisp October morning, she had begged to accompany him on his second visit to survey the property and determine whether it was worth keeping or should be sold to cover the taxes. She bounced on the wagon seat beside him as their horse. Old Pete clip-clopped along the country road, her small hands clutching a wooden doll that Isaac had carved for her last Christmas. "Uncle Isaac, why did your grandfather live in the English world?" she asked, using the Amish term for the outside community. Her questions came in rapid succession, as they always did. Was he sad? Did he have a house with electric lights? Did he remember us? Isaac considered his words carefully, as he always did with Ruth's questions. "I think he was searching for something, little one. Sometimes people have to go away to find what they're looking for, even when it makes them lonesome." But what was he looking for that he couldn't find here? It was a question Isaac couldn't answer, though it had troubled him through many sleepless nights since receiving the inheritance. What could drive a man to leave behind everything he had known, everyone he loved, for the uncertainty of the outside world? The dirt road ended at a rusted gate that hung open on broken hinges. Isaac helped Ruth down from the wagon and tied old Pete to a sturdy oak tree, giving the horse a handful of oats from his pocket. The morning air carried the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the distant sound of geese calling as they prepared for their southern journey. Ruth immediately ran toward the limestone outcropping, her small legs carrying her through the tall grass with the boundless energy of childhood. "Uncle Isaac, look! It's like a doorway to a castle." He followed more slowly, his practical mind cataloguing the work that would be needed to reclaim this land. The soil beneath the overgrowth was good. He could see that much. With enough time and effort, it could produce decent hay or serve as pasture for a few head of cattle. But the question remained whether the emotional cost of keeping Samuel's legacy was worth the potential benefit. "Ruth, stay where I can see you," he called as she approached the cave entrance. She had a tendency to explore first and consider consequences later, a trait that both charmed and worried him. "I will, Uncle Isaac, but look how cool it is in here." Before he could stop her, Ruth had ducked through the cave opening and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Isaac's heart jumped, and he hurried forward, calling her name. His flashlight beams swept the cave interior, revealing rough limestone walls and a floor covered with decades of fallen leaves and debris. "Ruth, come back here right now." Her voice, echoed from somewhere deeper in the cave, excited rather than frightened. "Uncle Isaac, there's a big room back here, and there are boxes." Isaac squeezed through the entrance, his broader shoulders barely fitting through the opening that Ruth had navigated so easily. The cave opened into a chamber roughly 20 feet across and 12 feet high, with a relatively flat floor that suggested it had been used before. Near the back wall, his flashlight beam revealed what had caught Ruth's attention: several wooden crates stacked neatly against the limestone, protected from moisture by what appeared to be oiled canvas. Ruth was already examining one of the crates, her small fingers tracing the wooden slats. "They have writing on them, Uncle Isaac, but it's not like our writing." Isaac moved closer, his flashlight revealing German script burned into the wood. His grandfather's handwriting, he realized with a start. The same careful letters from the year. Inheritance documents. The crates were old, but well-maintained, sealed with what looked like beeswax to keep out moisture and insects. "We shouldn't be disturbing these things, Ruth. They belong to your great-great-grandfather, and we don't know why he put them here." But even as he spoke, Isaac felt a pull of curiosity that matched his niece's enthusiasm. What had Samuel found important enough to preserve in this hidden place, and why had he gone to such lengths to protect it from the elements? Ruth had discovered something else. A smaller wooden box sitting atop one of the larger crates, secured with a simple wooden latch rather than beeswax. Before Isaac could stop her, she had opened it and was lifting out what appeared to be an old leather-bound book. "Uncle Isaac, look, it has pictures." The book fell open in her small hands, revealing pages covered with German text and detailed illustrations. Isaac's breath caught as he recognized what they were looking at. A journal of some kind, with drawings of plants, animals, and what appeared to be maps. On the page Ruth had opened to, he could make out a detailed sketch of the very cave they were standing in, complete with notations in Samuel's careful script. "Ruth, we need to leave these things alone and go home. We can come back another time with the bishop and decide what should be done." But Ruth was already reaching for something else, a small wooden cross that had been wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the opened box. As she lifted it, the ancient fabric crumbled, revealing intricate carving work that seemed to tell a story in symbols Isaac didn't recognize. "It's beautiful," Ruth whispered, turning the cross over in her small hands. "Uncle Isaac, why would someone hide something so pretty?" Looking at the cross, feeling the weight of history in this hidden chamber, Isaac began to understand that his grandfather's departure from the community might have been more complex than anyone had realized. The careful preservation of these items, the detailed illustrations in the journal, the very existence of this secret repository, all of it suggested a purpose beyond simple rebellion against their faith. "I don't know, little one," he said finally, taking the cross from her hands and examining the detailed carving. "But I think we're going to find out." As they emerged from the cave into the autumn sunlight, Isaac found himself looking back at the limestone outcropping with new eyes. Samuel hadn't just left them land, he had left them a mystery. And despite his natural caution, Isaac felt the same excitement that danced in Ruth's eyes as she skipped beside him toward the wagon. Whatever secrets his grandfather had hidden in that cave, they were about to change everything he thought he knew about his family's past. The wooden cross felt heavier in Isaac's hands than its size warranted as he and Ruth rode home in thoughtful silence. Ruth clutched the leather journal against her chest, occasionally opening it to peer at the mysterious illustrations and German text. Isaac had decided they should take only these 2 items for now, leaving the sealed crates undisturbed until he could seek guidance from the community elders. That evening, after Ruth had been tucked into bed with her usual bedtime story, Isaac sat at his kitchen table under the soft glow of an oil lamp, studying the journal his grandfather had left behind. The leather cover was worn smooth by countless hands, and the pages within told a story that made Isaac's chest tighten with emotions he couldn't quite name. The journal belonged to his great-great-grandfather, Johann Beiler, and chronicled a journey that Isaac had never heard described in such vivid detail. Johann's careful script, written in the German of their ancestors, documented not just the physical journey from Switzerland to Pennsylvania in 1752, but the desperate circumstances that had driven their family to abandon everything they knew. "The soldiers came again today," Johann had written on one page, accompanied by a detailed map of what appeared to be a Swiss valley. "They demanded to know where Heinrich and his family were hiding. When we would not betray our brother's location, they burned our meeting house. 7 families have already fled to the mountains. We must leave soon, or we will share Heinrich's fate." Isaac's German was rusty. Their community primarily spoke English in daily life, with German reserved for church services and old hymns. But he could understand enough to piece together a story that chilled him. His ancestors hadn't simply emigrated for better opportunities, as the family stories suggested. They had fled religious persecution that threatened their very lives. Another entry, dated several weeks later, described the journey with heartbreaking detail. "Little Anna took fever during the crossing. We had to leave her in the care of strangers in Rotterdam, praying that God would watch over her when we could not. The ship's captain warns that many who attempt this journey do not survive. But what choice do we have? To stay is certain death. To leave is hope, however slim." Isaac found himself thinking of Ruth upstairs in her small bed, trying to imagine the desperation that would drive parents to risk their children's lives on such a perilous journey. The courage it must have taken, the faith required to abandon everything familiar for the promise of religious freedom in an unknown land. As he turned the pages, Isaac discovered something that made his hands tremble. Tucked between 2 pages was a folded piece of parchment, yellow with age, but still intact. When he carefully unfolded it, he found official-looking documents written in what appeared to be Latin and German. Though he couldn't read the formal language, he recognized enough words to understand their significance: persecution orders, testimonies of faith, and what appeared to be sworn statements from other Anabaptist families. These weren't just family stories passed down through generations. They were legal documents, evidence of the systematic persecution their ancestors had faced. Someone had risked everything to preserve these papers, to ensure that future generations would understand the price of their freedom. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Isaac was feeding the chickens while Ruth gathered eggs when he heard the sound of buggy wheels on gravel. Bishop Miller's distinctive black carriage appeared at the end of the lane, pulled by his steady mare, Patience. The bishop rarely made social calls without invitation, and Isaac felt his stomach tighten as he watched the elderly man climb down from his seat with deliberate care. "Good morning, Isaac," Bishop Miller said, his weathered face serious but not unkind. "I trust you and little Ruth are well." "Good morning, Bishop. Yes, we're both fine. Ruth, come say hello to Bishop Miller." Ruth appeared from the chicken coop with her basket of eggs, offering the bishop her brightest smile. "Good morning, Bishop Miller. Would you like to see the pretty cross Uncle Isaac and I found?" Isaac felt his face flush. He had intended to seek the bishop's counsel before word spread about their discovery, but Ruth's innocent enthusiasm had apparently preceded his caution. "That's actually why I've come," Bishop Miller said gently. "Mary Stoltzfus mentioned that Ruth was telling her children about finding old things in a cave. Perhaps we should sit and talk about this discovery of yours." They settled on the front porch while Ruth ran off to play, and Isaac found himself explaining the previous day's events under the bishop's patient gaze. He described the cave, the hidden crates, and the journal that had kept him awake late into the night. When he produced the wooden cross and the persecution documents, Bishop Miller's expression grew increasingly grave. "These are troubling waters. You're wading into, Isaac," the bishop said after examining the documents. "Your grandfather Samuel came to me with similar papers 40 years ago. When I advised him to leave the past buried, he accused me of being afraid of our own history. The argument that followed led to his departure from our community." Isaac felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning air. "What did he want you to do with them?" "He wanted to share them with the community, to teach our young people about the price our ancestors paid for our faith. He believed that understanding our history would strengthen our commitment to the plain life. But I feared, and still fear, that dwelling on past persecution might breed resentment against our English neighbors, or worse, pride in our suffering." Bishop Miller rose and walked to the porch railing, gazing out at Isaac's well-tended fields. "Our strength comes from forgiveness, Isaac, from choosing peace over revenge, humility over pride. These documents speak of pain and injustice that could poison hearts if not handled with great care. But surely our people have a right to know their own history?" Isaac asked, thinking of Ruth's innocent delight in discovering connections to her ancestors. "Knowledge and wisdom are not always the same thing," the bishop replied. "Your grandfather believed that hiding our past was cowardice. I believed that preserving our present peace was wisdom. Neither of us was entirely wrong, but neither was entirely right." As if summoned by their conversation, Ruth appeared around the corner of the house, her small hands cupped around something she was trying not to drop. "Uncle Isaac, look what I found in the flower garden." She opened her hands to reveal several small metal objects, buttons, Isaac realized, but unlike any he had seen before. They were decorated with intricate patterns and what appeared to be religious symbols. "Where exactly did you find these, Ruth?" Bishop Miller asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Right by the big rose bush buried in the dirt. There are more of them, but these were the prettiest." Isaac and the bishop exchanged a look. The rose bush in question had been planted by Isaac's grandmother nearly 60 years ago, in a spot she had claimed was blessed by those who came before. Isaac had always assumed she meant it metaphorically. "Bishop Miller," Isaac said slowly, "what if Samuel wasn't just trying to stir up trouble? What if he knew something the rest of us had forgotten?" Before the bishop could respond, they heard the sound of another buggy approaching. This one belonged to Eli Stoltzfus, Isaac's neighbor, and one of the most respected men in their district. But Eli wasn't alone. Sitting beside him was a woman Isaac didn't recognize, someone clearly from the English world based on her clothing and the camera bag slung over her shoulder. "Isaac," Eli called as he climbed down from his buggy, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Margaret Webb. She's a historian from the university, and she's been asking questions about our family's early history. When I heard about Ruth's discoveries yesterday, I thought perhaps you should meet. Dr. Webb was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. She approached with the careful respect of someone who understood. She was entering a world very different from her own. "Mr. Beiler," she said, extending her hand, "I hope I'm not intruding. I've been researching Anabaptist immigration patterns for a book I'm writing, and Mr. Stoltzfus suggested that your family might have preserved some unusual historical materials." Isaac glanced at Bishop Miller, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "We have found some old papers," Isaac said carefully, "but I'm not sure they would be of interest to scholars." Dr. Webb's eyes lit up. Actually, any original documents from the 1750s would be extraordinarily valuable. Most immigrant families lost their papers during the journey or in the early years of settlement. If your family preserved documentation from that period, it could help us understand the full scope of the persecution that drove the Anabaptist migration. "Persecution?" Bishop Miller asked, his voice sharp. "Oh yes," Dr. Webb said, clearly unaware of the tension her words were creating. The systematic oppression of Anabaptist communities in Switzerland and Germany during that period was far more extensive than most people realize. Families were torn apart, property was confiscated, and many were imprisoned or executed simply for their religious beliefs. The few families who managed to preserve documentation of those experiences left behind invaluable historical records. Isaac felt the weight of the wooden cross in his pocket and thought of the anguish in Johann's careful script. His ancestor had risked everything to preserve not just his family's lives, but their story. How could Isaac honor that sacrifice while respecting the concerns of his community? Ruth, oblivious to the adult tensions swirling around her, tugged on Dr. Webb's coat. "Would you like to see our cave? That's where we found the pretty things." And just like that, with a child's innocent invitation, Isaac realized there was no going back. The secret Samuel had preserved for 40 years was about to emerge into the light, whether the community was ready or not. The tension on Isaac's front porch was thick enough to cut with a hay knife. Bishop Miller's weathered hands gripped the porch railing as he studied Dr. Webb with the careful assessment of a man who had spent decades protecting his community from outside influences. Ruth, meanwhile, bounced on her toes with barely contained excitement, waiting for an answer to her invitation. "Perhaps," Isaac said slowly, "we should all visit the cave together. If these documents are as significant as Dr. Webb suggests, then surely we owe it to our ancestors to understand what they preserved for us." Bishop Miller turned to face Isaac, his expression troubled. "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Are you prepared for the consequences of inviting the outside world into our private family matters?" "With respect," Bishop Eli Stoltzfus interjected, "isn't it possible that these aren't just private family matters? If Dr. Webb is right about the scope of the persecution, then what Isaac's family preserved might help all of us understand our shared history." Dr. Webb sensed the delicate nature of the situation and spoke carefully. "I want to assure you all that my interest is purely scholarly. Any documents or artifacts would remain in your community's possession. I'm simply hoping to learn from them to help ensure that the courage of families like yours isn't forgotten by future generations." Isaac made his decision. "Ruth, run inside and get your bonnet. We're going to show our guests the cave." The journey to Samuel's property took on the atmosphere of a pilgrimage. 2 buggies wound their way along the dirt road through the oak grove, with Ruth chattering excitedly in Isaac's wagon about all the treasures they were going to find. Dr. Webb rode with Eli, her notebook already out, as she peppered him with questions about local family histories and settlement patterns. Bishop Miller rode alone in his carriage, his face set in the expression Isaac recognized from his most serious sermons, the look of a man wrestling with competing duties to his faith and his flock. When they reached the limestone outcropping, Ruth immediately ran toward the cave entrance, but Isaac caught her hand. "We go together," he said firmly, "and we treat everything we find with the respect it deserves." The cave seemed smaller with 5 people crowded into its entrance chamber, but Dr. Webb's sharp intake of breath when she saw the carefully preserved crates told Isaac that their significance was even greater than he had imagined. "These storage methods," she murmured, running her hands over the beeswax seals, "this level of preservation, whoever did this understood the historical value of what they were protecting." "May I?" Isaac nodded, and Dr. Webb carefully opened one of the larger crates. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were more journals, several small wooden boxes, and what appeared to be a collection of handwritten hymns. But it was the item at the bottom of the crate that made everyone fall silent, an ancient hymn book, its leather cover worn smooth by countless hands, with text in the old German that even Bishop Miller struggled to read. "This is an original." "Ausbund," Bishop Miller whispered, his earlier reluctance forgotten in the face of such a treasure. I haven't seen one this old outside of our most precious church collections." Ruth, meanwhile, had discovered another wooden box and was carefully lifting out what appeared to be pieces of fabric arranged in a specific pattern. "Uncle Isaac, these look like pieces for a quilt, but they're all different colors and shapes." Dr. Webb examined the fabric pieces with growing excitement. "These appear to be pattern pieces for a traditional Swiss quilt design. If I'm not mistaken, this pattern was thought to be lost. Families stopped making these quilts after the persecution because the design was considered too distinctive, too identifying." Isaac found himself thinking of his grandmother's stories about a special quilt pattern that had been passed down through the women of their family but had been lost over the generations. Could these be the pieces of that legendary pattern? "Dr. Webb," Bishop Miller said slowly, "you mentioned that most families lost their documentation during immigration. Yet Isaac's family appears to have preserved an extraordinary amount of material. Why do you think that is?" Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment, studying the careful organization of the cave's contents. "In my research, I've found that certain families served as unofficial record keepers for their communities. They took on the responsibility of preserving not just their own history, but the collective memory of all the families who made the journey. It was dangerous work. If they were caught with these documents, the consequences would have been severe." "You're saying our family were the historians?" Isaac asked. "More than that," Dr. Webb replied. "I think your family were the guardians of memory for an entire community of refugees. These documents don't just tell your story, they tell the story of everyone who fled persecution and sought freedom in Pennsylvania." Ruth had found another treasure, a small wooden toy, carved with the same intricate detail as the cross she had discovered the day before. It was a horse and wagon, complete with tiny figures that appeared to represent an Amish family. As she turned it over in her small hands, Isaac noticed writing carved into the base. "For the children who will know. Freedom," Isaac read aloud, translating the German inscription. "Made by grateful hands in the New World, 1753. The simple toy carried the weight of profound gratitude, a gift from ancestors who had risked everything so that their descendants could live without fear." Isaac felt tears prick his eyes as he imagined Johann Beiler, his great-great-grandfather, carving this toy for his own children after surviving the dangerous journey to Pennsylvania. Bishop Miller was examining the Ausbund with reverent hands. "The songs in this book," he said quietly, "they're versions I've never heard before. Verses that speak specifically about persecution and exile. We've been singing abbreviated versions for generations, never knowing what was left out. Why would the verses be shortened?" Dr. Webb asked. "Perhaps," Eli suggested, "because our ancestors wanted their children to remember hope rather than hatred. Maybe they thought focusing on persecution would keep old wounds from healing." Isaac understood now why his grandfather Samuel had been so passionate about preserving these materials. They weren't just relics of the past. They were keys to understanding the depth of their ancestors' sacrifice and the true foundation of their faith. But he also understood Bishop Miller's concerns. How do you honor the past without becoming trapped by it? "There's something else," Ruth announced, having found yet another small wooden box. This one contained what appeared to be seeds, carefully wrapped in packets made from scraps of cloth. Each packet was labeled in the same careful German script they had seen throughout the cave. Dr. Webb examined the seed packets with growing amazement. "These are heritage seeds, varieties that were brought from the old country. Many of these plants haven't been grown in America for over a century. If they're still viable, we could grow our ancestors' gardens," Isaac finished, understanding the profound connection this represented. "We could literally cultivate the same plants they tended in Switzerland." As they prepared to leave the cave, Isaac realized that Samuel hadn't just preserved documents and artifacts. He had preserved a complete picture of their ancestors' world. Every carefully chosen item told part of a larger story about faith, courage, and the determination to preserve what mattered. The question now was what to do with this incredible legacy. And Isaac suspected the decision would test their community in ways none of them were prepared for. Word of the cave discoveries spread through the Amish community with the speed of wind through wheat fields. By the time Isaac and Ruth returned home that evening, 3 families had already stopped by to inquire about the old things Ruth had found. Isaac could see the mixture of curiosity and concern in his neighbor's eyes, the same conflict he felt in his own heart. The next morning brought Sarah Yoder to his door. Sarah was the school teacher for their district, a young woman of 26 who had chosen education over marriage, much to her parents' gentle disappointment. She was known for her quick mind and thoughtful questions, traits that had occasionally put her at odds with more traditional community members. "Isaac," she said, as he welcomed her into his kitchen, "I've been thinking about what Eli told me regarding the documents you found. I wonder if I might see them, for educational purposes, you understand." Ruth, who was practicing her letters at the kitchen table, looked up with bright eyes. "Sarah, wait until you see the pretty quilt pieces. And there's a book with pictures of our old country." Isaac poured Sarah a cup of coffee and settled across from her at the table. "Bishop Miller is concerned that dwelling on past persecution might not be healthy for our community. He may be right. Or he may be wrong," Sarah said quietly. "Isaac, I teach our children about forgiveness and peace. But how can they truly understand the value of what we have if they don't know what it costs to achieve it?" She opened her teaching satchel and pulled out a worn history book. "This is what English children learn about our ancestors. 2 paragraphs about German immigrants seeking religious freedom. There's no mention of the families torn apart, the courage required, the faith that sustained them through impossible circumstances." Isaac found himself nodding. "The documents we found tell a very different story." "Exactly. And not just your family's story. If Dr. Webb is right, these materials could help all of us understand our shared heritage. Shouldn't our children know that their great-great-grandparents were heroes?" Ruth looked up from her letters. "Were they really heroes, Uncle Isaac?" "Yes, little one," Isaac said softly. "They were very brave people who loved God more than they." "Via danger," Sarah leaned forward. "Would you consider letting me study the materials? I'm fluent in German, and I have some experience with historical documents from my time in the English schools before I joined the church. Perhaps I could help translate and organize what you've found." Isaac felt pulled in different directions. Part of him wanted to honor Bishop Miller's wishes and leave the past buried. But another part, the part that had felt his ancestor Johann's anguish through those carefully preserved pages, knew that such courage deserved to be remembered. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "My grandmother used to tell stories about a special quilt pattern that belonged to our family. She said it was lost during her mother's time, but the description she gave matches what Ruth described to the other children." Ruth jumped up from her chair. "Could we make the quilt? Sarah, could we follow the pattern like our great-great-grandmothers did?" "That's exactly what I was thinking," Sarah said with a smile. "A project that connects our children to their heritage while teaching them traditional skills. It would be educational and practical, everything our community values." Isaac could see the wisdom in Sarah's approach, but he also recognized the potential complications. What if the pattern is distinctive enough to attract outside attention? Dr. Webb seemed to think it was historically significant. "Then perhaps," Sarah said carefully, "it's time our community learned to share our history on our own terms, rather than having others interpret it for us." That afternoon, Isaac made a decision that surprised even himself. He hitched up old Pete and drove to the property where his sister Mary lived with her husband and 4 children. Mary was 3 years older than Isaac, and had inherited their mother's practical wisdom along with her gift for quilting. "I need your opinion on something," Isaac told her as they sat on her back porch while her children played in the yard. He showed her the fabric pieces Ruth had found, carefully explaining their possible significance. Mary's hands trembled as she examined the pieces. "Isaac," she whispered, "this is the pattern Grandmother described. I'm certain of it. Look at this corner piece. She always said our family's pattern had a distinctive star design right here. Sarah Yoder thinks we should try to recreate the quilt." "Sarah's a bright girl with good judgment," Mary said, still studying the pattern pieces. "And she's right. This is exactly the kind of project our community needs, something that honors our past while serving our present." "But Bishop Miller is a good man who's guided us well for many years," Mary interrupted gently. "But sometimes good leaders can be overly cautious. Not every change threatens our way of life, Isaac. Some changes strengthen it. That evening, as Isaac tucked Ruth into bed, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Uncle Isaac, are we going to keep the pretty things hidden like Grandfather Samuel did? What do you think we should do with them?" "I think," Ruth said with the clarity that sometimes comes only from children, "that things hidden in the dark should come into the light. That's what you told me when I was afraid of the storm cellar." Isaac smiled at his own words being reflected. Back to him. "You're right, little one. Things hidden in the dark should come into the light." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Dr. Webb, arriving alone in a modest sedan that looked out of place parked beside Isaac's barn. She approached the house with obvious hesitation, clearly aware that she was potentially overstepping boundaries. "Mr. Beiler," she said when Isaac answered her knock, "I hope you don't mind my coming by unannounced. I've been thinking about yesterday's discoveries, and I believe I may have information that could help your community understand their historical significance." Isaac invited her in for coffee, and Dr. Webb spread several photographs and documents across his kitchen table. "These are images from archives in Switzerland," she explained. "Church records, persecution documents, immigration lists. I've been comparing them to what we found yesterday, and the connections are remarkable." One photograph showed a page from a Swiss church record listing families who had been expelled for Anabaptist heresy in 1751. Isaac's breath caught as he saw familiar names, not just Beiler, but Stoltzfus, Yoder, and Miller. "Your families weren't just fellow travelers," Dr. Webb said quietly. "They were part of an organized group that helped each other escape. The documents in your cave don't just preserve your family's story, they preserve the story of your entire community's founding families." Isaac stared at the records, understanding dawning. His ancestors hadn't just been refugees, they had been part of a network of families who had supported each other through the most dangerous period of their lives. The cave wasn't just a hiding place, it was a monument to community cooperation and mutual aid. "Dr. Webb," he said slowly, "I think it's time our community learned the whole truth about where we came from." The community meeting was held in the Stoltzfus barn, the largest gathering space in their district. Isaac arrived early with Ruth, his stomach tight with nervous energy. Word had spread throughout the community that he had something important to share about the old papers found on Samuel's property, and the barn was filled with familiar faces marked by curiosity, concern, and in some cases, barely concealed disapproval. Bishop Miller entered with his characteristic dignity, followed by the other ordained men of the district. Isaac noticed that several families had chosen not to attend, a pointed absence that spoke volumes about the division his discoveries had already created. Sarah Yoder sat near the front with several other young adults, her teaching satchel at her feet. She had spent the previous 3 days helping Isaac organize and translate the most significant documents, and her support gave him courage for what was to come. "Brothers and sisters," Bishop Miller began, his voice carrying easily. "Through the barn, Isaac Beiler has asked to share with us some materials discovered on his grandfather's property. Before we begin, let us remember that we are gathered in the spirit of community discernment, seeking God's wisdom for our path forward." Isaac stood slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. Ruth, sitting beside Mary, gave him an encouraging smile that steadied his nerves. "Friends," Isaac began, "what I'm about to share may challenge some of the stories we've been told about our ancestors, but I believe these materials honor their memory rather than diminish it." He began with Johann's journal, reading selected passages that describe the persecution in Switzerland and the dangerous journey to Pennsylvania. As his voice carried his ancestors' words through the barn, Isaac watched the faces of his community change from skepticism to amazement to deep emotion. When he read Johann's account of leaving little Anna with strangers in Rotterdam, several of the women wiped tears from their eyes. When he described the courage required to abandon everything for an uncertain future, the men nodded with understanding born of their own struggles with difficult decisions. Our ancestors weren't just seeking better farmland, Isaac concluded. They were fleeing for their lives, preserving not just their own families, but their faith itself. Eli Stoltzfus stood up from his seat near the back. "Isaac, you mentioned finding church records. Did any of them mention specific families?" Isaac nodded and showed the group Dr. Webb's photographs of the Swiss persecution records. As he read the familiar names, Stoltzfus, Yoder, Miller, King, Lapp, a murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd. "We weren't just neighbors in the New World," Isaac said. "Our families were bound together by shared suffering and mutual aid long before they reached Pennsylvania. But not everyone was moved by these revelations. Aaron Lapp, one of the more conservative members of their community, stood with a stern expression. "Isaac Beiler, what purpose does it serve to dwell on old grievances? Our Lord taught us to forgive our enemies, not to nurse ancient wounds." "With respect, Aaron," Sarah Yoder said, rising from her seat, "understanding our history isn't the same as nursing wounds. When we teach our children about David and Goliath, we're not encouraging them to hold grudges against Philistines. We're teaching them about courage in the face of overwhelming odds. But these documents," Aaron continued, "they speak of suffering and injustice. How does that strengthen our commitment to peace and forgiveness?" Ruth, who had been listening with the intense concentration that children bring to adult conversations they don't fully understand, suddenly stood up. "Mr. Lapp," she said in her clear young voice, "when my papa died, Uncle Isaac told me that remembering him didn't make me sad. It made me grateful for the time we had together. Maybe remembering our old grandparents is like that too." The barn fell silent as Ruth's simple wisdom settled over the gathered community. Isaac felt a surge of pride and love for his brave little niece, who had unknowingly articulated what he had been struggling to express. It was then that Isaac revealed his next discovery, the hand-forged tools Ruth had found deeper in the cave the previous day. He had brought several pieces with him, a hammer, a set of horseshoe punches, and a beautiful plane that bore the distinctive marks of exceptional craftsmanship. "These belong to our ancestor Johann," Isaac explained, "but they tell us something important about his place in the community. The quality of this work suggests he wasn't just any refugee. He was a master craftsman whose skills helped build the early settlements. David Miller, the bishop's youngest son and a skilled carpenter, himself examined the plane with obvious admiration. 'The balance is perfect,' he said quietly, 'and look at these decorative details. This isn't just functional work, it's artistry.'" Isaac had saved the most significant revelation for last. From his satchel, he withdrew a document that Sarah had helped him translate just that morning, a land deed written in faded German script. This deed, Isaac announced, shows that Johann Beiler originally purchased not just the 20 acres I inherited, but over 300 acres throughout this valley. Much of the land our families farm today was originally owned by our ancestor. These implications hit the community like a stone dropped in still water. Several families exchanged glances as they realized that their current struggles with rising land prices and development pressure had historical precedent. What happened to the rest of the land? Eli asked. According to the documents, it was gradually sold off over the generations to help other families establish themselves. Johann and his descendants used their prosperity to aid new immigrants and struggling neighbors. Bishop Miller, who had been listening with increasing thoughtfulness, finally spoke. Isaac, what you're describing sounds like the mutual aid societies our grandparents used to tell stories about. Communities where families helped each other through difficult times. Exactly, Isaac said. And there's more. He showed them the final document, a covenant signed by 12 families, including all the major family names in their current community. The agreement, written in careful German script, committed the families to support each other through times of trial and seasons of plenty, to preserve their faith traditions while adapting to their new homeland, and to ensure that future generations would understand the price of their freedom. We're not just neighbors, Isaac concluded. We're the heirs of a promise made by our ancestors to care for each other and preserve what they died to protect. The barn was completely quiet as the full weight of these discoveries settled over the community. They weren't just individual families who happened to share religious beliefs. They were part of a covenant community whose bonds stretched back over 2 centuries. It was Sarah who broke the silence. The question isn't whether we should preserve these materials, she said. The question is how we can honor the promise our ancestors made. And with those words, Isaac realized that the division he had feared might actually become the foundation for a stronger, more connected community than they had ever known. The days following the community meeting brought both unexpected support and troubling resistance. Isaac found himself at the center of a quiet revolution that was reshaping how their district understood itself. But not everyone welcomed the change. 3 families, the Lapps, the Kings, and the Hostettlers, had requested meetings with Bishop Miller to express their concerns about worldly influences creeping into their community. Isaac learned this from Mary, who heard it from her neighbor's wife during a quilting circle. The knowledge that some of his neighbors viewed him as a threat to their way of life weighed heavily on his mind. But there were encouraging developments as well. Sarah had organized a group of young adults to help with the careful translation and preservation of the documents. They met twice a week in the evenings, working by lamplight in Isaac's kitchen while Ruth played quietly nearby. The enthusiasm of the younger generation for learning about their heritage was both heartening and concerning. It highlighted the generational divide that Isaac's discoveries had revealed. Dr. Webb had returned twice with additional research materials, each visit bringing new connections between the cave documents and broader historical records. She had also introduced Isaac to Professor David Miller, who, despite sharing the bishop's surname, was no relation, a specialist in Anabaptist history from a nearby university. Professor Miller proved to be a gentleman in his 60s who approached the community's treasures with reverence rather than mere academic interest. He had grown up Mennonite before pursuing his education in the outside world, and his respectful manner helped ease some of the community's concerns about outsider involvement. What your family preserved, Professor Miller told Isaac during his first visit, represents one of the most complete persecution archives I've ever encountered. Most families lost everything during their escape. Documents were destroyed to avoid identification. Personal items were abandoned for weight considerations. That your ancestors managed to preserve so much suggests extraordinary planning and sacrifice. It was during Professor Miller's second visit that Ruth made her most significant discovery yet. While the adults studied documents in the cave, she had wandered to a section they hadn't thoroughly explored, a narrow passage that led to a smaller chamber. Her excited shouts brought everyone running. "Uncle Isaac, there's a whole room back here with boxes and pictures on the walls." The secondary chamber was smaller than the main cave, but contained treasures that left even Professor Miller speechless. The walls were covered with what appeared to be a primitive but detailed mural depicting the journey from Switzerland to Pennsylvania. Figures in plain dress led horses and wagons through mountain passes, crossed stormy seas, and finally knelt in thanksgiving on what was unmistakably Pennsylvania soil. But it was the boxes in this chamber that proved most significant. Unlike the wooden crates in the main cave, these were metal containers that Professor Miller identified as more recent additions, probably from the 1920s or 1930s, based on their construction. Inside the first container, they found photographs, dozens of them, showing Amish families from various time periods, along with what appeared to be the original surveyor's maps of their entire settlement. Isaac recognized his grandfather Samuel as a young man in several of the photos, standing with groups of families Isaac didn't recognize. These appear to be documentation of land purchases and settlements throughout this region, Professor Miller observed, studying the maps. Your grandfather was apparently tracking the expansion of Amish communities across multiple states. The second container held the most surprising discovery yet: correspondence between Samuel and Amish communities throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and beyond. The letters, dating from the 1950s through the 1980s, revealed that Samuel had been part of an informal network, preserving and sharing historical materials among various Amish settlements. He wasn't just preserving your community's history, Dr. Webb realized as she read through the correspondence. He was coordinating with other families to create a comprehensive archive of Anabaptist immigration and settlement patterns. Isaac felt his understanding of his grandfather shift once again. Samuel hadn't simply been a man who chose worldly ways over plain faith. He had been a scholar and preservationist working to protect their collective heritage. But the most significant find was yet to come. In the deepest corner of the secondary chamber, Ruth discovered a final wooden box that contained what appeared to be the original land deed for their entire settlement, not just individual farms, but the master document that had established their community as a religious settlement with specific protections under Pennsylvania law. "This changes everything," Professor Miller said quietly as he examined the deed. "This document grants your community collective ownership rights that most modern Amish settlements don't possess. Your ancestors didn't just buy individual farms, they established a religious preserve with legal protections that are still valid today." The implications were staggering. Recent years had brought increasing pressure from developers who wanted to purchase Amish farmland for housing developments. Several families had been approached with offers that were difficult to refuse, given the rising costs of farming and the financial pressures of modern life. But if Professor Miller was correct, the original deed might provide legal protections that could preserve their community's agricultural character for future generations. "We need to verify this with current legal authorities," Dr. Webb cautioned. "Historical documents don't always translate into modern legal protections, but if this deed is valid, it could be the key to preserving not just your community, but other Amish settlements facing similar pressures." That evening, as Isaac sat in his kitchen reviewing the day's discoveries, he found himself thinking about Samuel's true mission. His grandfather hadn't abandoned their faith. He had spent 40 years working to protect it from threats the community hadn't even recognized. Sarah knocked on his door just as he was preparing for bed. "Isaac, I've been thinking about what we learned today. If Samuel was working with other communities to preserve our history, don't we have an obligation to continue his work? What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we establish a formal heritage preserve here, a place where Amish families from throughout the region can bring their historical materials for preservation and study. We could honor Samuel's vision while ensuring that future generations understand the price of their freedom. Isaac looked toward the stairs where Ruth was sleeping, thinking about the world she would inherit. You realize that would mean permanent involvement with the outside world, scholars, legal experts, possibly even government officials. Yes, Sarah said simply, but isn't that better than losing our heritage entirely? As Isaac considered her words, he realized that his grandfather's legacy had brought them to a crossroads. They could choose the safety of isolation and risk losing their history to time and neglect, or they could choose the uncertainty of engagement and work to preserve their heritage for future generations. The decision, he knew, would define their community for decades to come. Isaac was preparing breakfast when Ruth came running into the kitchen, her face flushed with excitement and something that looked like confusion. She was clutching a metal box he had never seen before, newer than the historical artifacts they had been finding, with a modern lock that had been carefully broken. "Uncle Isaac, I found another box, but this one has papers with your name on." "Them?" Isaac's hands stilled over the coffee pot. "Where did you find that, Ruth?" "In the very back of the little cave room, behind a pile of rocks. I was looking for more pretty stones when I saw the corner sticking out." With trembling hands, Isaac took the box from Ruth and examined it. Unlike the historical containers they had discovered, this one was clearly from the modern era, perhaps from the 1970s or 1980s, based on its design. The broken lock suggested that someone had opened it recently, though Isaac couldn't imagine who. Inside the box were dozens of letters, all addressed to Isaac Beiler in his grandfather Samuel's familiar handwriting. The postmarks ranged from 1985 to 2003, covering nearly 20 years of correspondence that Isaac had never received. "Ruth, go finish getting dressed for school," Isaac said gently. "I need to read these letters." As Ruth ran upstairs, Isaac spread the letters across his kitchen table in chronological order. What he discovered in those pages would change everything he thought he knew about his grandfather's departure and his own life's path. The earliest letter, dated just 2 months after Isaac's 18th birthday, began with words that made his chest tight. "My dear grandson, I write this knowing it may never reach you, but hoping that someday you will understand why I had to leave our community and why I can never return." Samuel's careful script revealed a story that Isaac had never imagined. Far from being a man who had chosen worldly ways over faith, Samuel had discovered in the early 1980s that several Amish communities throughout Pennsylvania were being systematically cheated out of their ancestral lands through a complex scheme involving forged documents and corrupt officials. I learned that developers were using false historical claims to challenge the original land grants that established our settlements, Samuel wrote. They would produce documents showing that our ancestors never had clear title to their properties, then force families into expensive legal battles they couldn't afford. Many families lost farms that had been in their possession for over a century. Isaac's hands shook as he read his grandfather's account of traveling throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, documenting legitimate land ownership and gathering evidence of the fraud. Samuel had discovered that the scheme reached into county courthouses, where original records were being altered or destroyed to support false claims. "I tried to warn Bishop Miller and the other elders," Samuel continued in a letter from 1987, "but they accused me of bringing worldly troubles into our peaceful community. They couldn't understand that our peace was built on legal foundations that were being systematically undermined." The most heartbreaking letters described Samuel's growing isolation from his family and community. Your father returned my letters. Unopened, he wrote in 1990. I understand his anger, but I wish he could see that everything I'm doing is to protect what our ancestors died to preserve. As Isaac read on, he discovered that Samuel had spent decades building legal cases to protect Amish lands throughout the region. He had worked with sympathetic lawyers, historians, and government officials to expose the fraud and establish clear title protections for religious communities. I have preserved in the cave not just our family's historical documents, Samuel wrote in a 1995 letter, but legal evidence that will protect our community for generations to come. The developers who tried to steal our heritage have been defeated, but the protections I fought for will only remain valid if future generations understand what was at stake. The letters from the late 1990s revealed Samuel's failing health and his growing concern about who would continue his work. I had hoped your father would forgive me long enough to understand what I accomplished, he wrote in 1999. Since that seems unlikely, I place my faith in the next generation. You were always a thoughtful boy, Isaac. Perhaps when you're older you'll see what others could not. The final letters, written in the early 2000s, contained detailed instructions for accessing and understanding the materials Samuel had preserved. But they also contained something Isaac had never expected: personal messages about his own life that demonstrated how closely Samuel had followed his grandson's journey from a distance. I learned of your marriage to Rachel through friends in the community, Samuel wrote in 2001. I wish I could have been there to see you so happy. I pray that God will bless your union with many children and that your family will understand the heritage I preserved for them. A later letter, dated 2003, showed Samuel's heartbreak over Rachel's death in childbirth. My heart breaks for your loss, dear grandson. I know the pain of isolation that grief can bring. Please know that even though I cannot be present, you are never alone in this world. Isaac had to stop reading for several minutes as tears blurred his vision. All those years when he had felt abandoned by family, when the community's sympathy had felt insufficient against his loneliness. His grandfather had been thinking of him, praying for him, wishing he could offer comfort. The final letter in the collection was dated just months before Samuel's death. Isaac, if you are reading this, then my earthly work is complete, and God has chosen you to be the guardian of our family's true legacy. The cave contains not just historical artifacts, but legal documents that will protect our entire community from those who would steal our heritage. You must understand, I didn't leave our faith behind. I spent my life protecting it from threats our community couldn't see. Isaac discovered that the broken lock hadn't been forced recently. It had been opened by Samuel himself, who had apparently returned to the cave one final time before his death to add a letter specifically intended for Isaac as an adult. This final message contained something that made Isaac's heart race. Detailed maps showing the locations of similar document caches that Samuel had helped establish in other Amish communities throughout the region. You are part of a network now, Isaac, Samuel wrote. Other families in other settlements have preserved pieces of this puzzle. Together, these materials tell the complete story of our people's journey and provide legal protections that no single community could establish alone. But the most shocking revelation came in the very last paragraph. By the time you read this, you will have met Dr. Margaret Webb and Professor David Miller. They are not strangers to our family's story. They have been helping me document and preserve Anabaptist heritage for over 20 years. Dr. Webb's grandmother was Anna Beiler, the child our ancestor Johann had to leave with strangers in Rotterdam. She survived, married, and never forgot her Amish roots. Professor Miller is descended from the Bishop Miller, who helped our families establish their first settlement in Pennsylvania. They are your cousins, Isaac, working to preserve our shared heritage from the outside world because circumstances forced their families to follow different paths. Isaac sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the implications. The historians who had seemed like helpful strangers were actually distant relatives who had been working with Samuel for decades to protect their common heritage. The cave discoveries weren't accidental. They were part of a carefully orchestrated plan to ensure that crucial historical and legal documents would be preserved and understood by future generations. Ruth came bouncing down the stairs, ready for breakfast, but stopped when she saw Isaac's expression. "Uncle Isaac, are you sad about the letters?" "No, little one," Isaac said, gathering her into a hug. "I'm not sad, I'm amazed. Your great-great-grandfather Samuel wasn't lost to us. He was working to protect us all along." As Isaac prepared Ruth's breakfast, his mind raced with the implications of Samuel's revelations. The community meeting they had planned for the following week would need to address not just the historical significance of their discoveries, but the modern legal protections Samuel had spent his life establishing. More importantly, Isaac now understood that his role wasn't just to preserve the past, it was to continue Samuel's work protecting their community's future. The developers and land speculators who threatened Amish settlements throughout the region were the same forces Samuel had been fighting for decades. The materials in the cave weren't just historical artifacts, they were weapons in an ongoing battle for the survival of their way of life. That afternoon, Isaac drove to Bishop Miller's house to share Samuel's letters. He found the elderly man working in his workshop, crafting a rocking chair with the careful precision that had made him respected throughout their community for both his spiritual leadership and his practical skills. "Bishop Miller," Isaac began, "I need to show you something that will change how we understand my grandfather's departure from our community." As Isaac read selected passages from Samuel's letters, he watched the bishop's expression shift from skepticism to surprise to deep sorrow. When Isaac finished, Bishop Miller set down his tools and was quiet for several long minutes. "Isaac," the bishop finally said, 40 years ago, I made a decision based on incomplete understanding. I thought Samuel was choosing the world over, or faith. I never imagined he was choosing to protect our faith by engaging with the world. He doesn't blame you in his letters," Isaac said gently. "He understood why the community couldn't support his work. But he also believed that someday we would need to understand what he accomplished." Bishop Miller nodded slowly. "And that time has come. Isaac, I owe you and your grandfather an apology. More than that, I owe our entire community the truth about Samuel's sacrifice." As Isaac prepared to leave, Bishop Miller asked one final question. "What do you plan to do with this knowledge?" Isaac thought of Ruth's innocent delight in discovering their family's treasures, of Sarah's enthusiasm for teaching their history to the next generation, and of the broader network of families Samuel had worked to protect. "I plan to finish what my grandfather started," Isaac said. "Our community needs to understand not just where we came from, but what Samuel did to ensure we'll have a place to go." The truth about Samuel's mission would soon transform their quiet district into the center of a preservation effort that would impact Amish communities throughout America. But first, Isaac had to help his neighbors understand that sometimes protecting their way of life required engaging with the very world they had sought to keep at arm's length. The revelation of Samuel's true mission transformed the atmosphere in their district with the speed of a summer storm. Within days of Isaac sharing the letters with Bishop Miller, word had spread throughout their community and beyond. The phone in the Stoltzfus family's workshop, their district's only connection to the outside world for emergencies, rang constantly, with calls from Amish communities throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. Apparently, Samuel's network of preservation efforts had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Families from dozens of settlements were reporting that they too had found similar document caches, often in caves, root cellars, or other hidden locations on properties that had been owned by relatives who had left their communities decades Earlier, Dr. Webb and Professor Miller arrived at Isaac's farm 3 days after the letter discovery, both carrying thick folders of documentation that corroborated Samuel's claims about the land fraud schemes. Dr. Webb's hands trembled slightly as she spread legal documents across Isaac's kitchen table. "Isaac," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something I should have revealed when we first met. My grandmother was Anna Beiler, the child your ancestor Johann left with strangers in Rotterdam. She survived eventually, immigrated to America on her own, and spent her entire life searching for information about the family she lost." Professor Miller nodded gravely. "And my own family connection to your Bishop Miller line is why I dedicated my academic career to preserving Anabaptist history. We're not just researchers, Isaac. We're family members who have been working to preserve our shared heritage from the outside world." Isaac felt the profound weight of generational planning that had brought them all together. "Samuel knew this when he contacted you? He reached out to us in the early 1980s when he discovered that both our families had been researching similar historical questions," Dr. Webb explained. "When he learned about our family connections, he invited us to join his preservation network. We've been documenting and protecting Amish heritage sites throughout the region for over 20 years. The scope of Samuel's work was staggering. Professor Miller showed Isaac maps marking over 40 locations where historical materials had been preserved, creating a comprehensive archive of Anabaptist settlement patterns, land ownership documents, and persecution records spanning 3 centuries. But the most important thing your grandfather accomplished," Professor Miller continued, "was the legal framework he helped establish. Working with sympathetic lawyers and government officials, Samuel documented systematic attempts to defraud Amish communities of their ancestral lands. His evidence led to federal investigations and new legal protections for religious communities." Dr. Webb opened another folder containing more recent documents. The Heritage Protection Act that was passed by the Pennsylvania legislature in 1998 was largely based on evidence Samuel provided. It gives religious communities like yours special legal status that makes it much more difficult for developers to challenge your land ownership. Isaac studied the legal documents, recognizing the careful documentation style that characterized all of Samuel's work. Why didn't he ever tell the community what he had accomplished? He tried, Professor Miller said sadly. But by the time his legal victories were won, he had been shunned for so long that the community wouldn't listen to his explanations. He hoped that someday circumstances would arise that would allow the truth to emerge naturally. The circumstances had indeed arisen. That very week, Isaac learned, a major development company had filed preliminary paperwork challenging the land ownership of 3 Amish communities in neighboring counties. Without Samuel's preserved documentation and the legal protections he had helped establish, those communities would have faced ruinous legal battles. Sarah arrived at Isaac's farm that evening with news that the young adults in their community had been meeting informally to discuss how they should respond to these revelations. "Isaac, we want to establish a formal heritage center here, using your grandfather's cave as the foundation. We could create a place where Amish families throughout the region could bring their historical materials for preservation and study." "What would that mean for our community?" Isaac asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "It would mean permanent engagement with the outside world," Sarah admitted. "Scholars, lawyers, government officials, people who could help us preserve our way of life but who aren't part of our faith community. It would mean change, Isaac, significant change." Bishop Miller arrived as Sarah was speaking, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of the stress he had been carrying since learning the truth about Samuel. Isaac, I've been praying about this situation constantly. I've also been receiving visits from other bishops throughout the region who are facing similar challenges. The bishop sat heavily in Isaac's kitchen chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. 3 communities have already approached me about sending delegations to study what you've preserved here. They're dealing with development pressures, land disputes, and challenges to their religious protections. They need access to the historical and legal materials your grandfather preserved. What are you saying, Bishop? I'm saying that whether we choose it or not, we're about to become the center of a preservation effort that will affect Amish communities throughout America. The question isn't whether this will happen, it's whether we'll approach it thoughtfully and maintain our values while protecting our heritage. Ruth, who had been playing quietly in the corner while the adults talked, suddenly looked up from her dolls. Uncle Isaac, remember when you told me that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing to do? Isaac smiled at his niece's ability to cut through complex adult discussions with simple clarity. Yes, little one, I remember. I think this is one of those times. Over the following days, Isaac found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Delegations from Amish communities throughout the region arrived to study the materials preserved in Samuel's cave. Each group brought their own historical documents and stories that added pieces to the larger puzzle of Anabaptist settlement and survival in America. The meetings took place in the Stoltzfus barn, with Bishop Miller presiding over discussions that were unlike anything their community had ever experienced. Representatives from 12 different settlements gathered to examine maps, legal documents, and historical materials that told the complete story of their shared heritage. Dr. Webb and Professor Miller provided historical context and legal expertise, but they were careful to let the Amish communities maintain control over their own materials and decisions. Isaac was struck by the respectful way the scholars deferred to community wisdom while offering their professional knowledge. It was during one of these meetings that the most significant discovery emerged. A family from Holmes County, Ohio, had brought documents that perfectly complemented the materials from Samuel's cave. When the papers were arranged together, they revealed the complete legal framework that Samuel had spent decades establishing to protect Amish lands throughout the region. What we're looking at, Professor Miller explained to the assembled group, is a comprehensive system of legal protections that covers religious communities in 5 states. Your grandfather didn't just preserve your community's heritage, Isaac. He created a legal shield that protects thousands of families. But the true test of their community's commitment would come the following week, when representatives from the development company that had been challenging Amish land ownership requested a meeting. They wanted to examine the historical documents and assess whether their legal challenges had any merit in light of Samuel's preserved evidence. "This is our moment," Sarah told Isaac as they prepared for what everyone understood would be the decisive confrontation. "Everything your grandfather worked for, everything we've discovered about our heritage, it all comes down to whether we can stand together and protect what he died to preserve." Isaac looked out at the community that had raised him, the land that had sustained his family for generations, and the cave that had revealed secrets spanning centuries. Tomorrow would determine whether Samuel's 40-year sacrifice had been sufficient to protect their way of life for future generations. The burden of that responsibility felt enormous, but as Isaac watched Ruth playing in the yard where his ancestors had played for over 2 centuries, he knew that some burdens were worth carrying. The morning of the confrontation dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the ground like a blessing. Isaac stood in his kitchen, watching the sun rise over fields that his ancestors had cleared with their own hands, and felt the weight of generations resting on his shoulders. Today would determine whether Samuel's life work had been sufficient to protect their community's future. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the Stoltzfus barn, the same space where Isaac had first shared his discoveries with the community weeks earlier. But this gathering would be different. Representatives from Hartwell Development Corporation would be present, along with their lawyers and historical consultants, prepared to challenge the validity of documents that Samuel had died to preserve. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, carefully arranging pieces of the heritage quilt pattern that the community women had been working on together. The project had become a symbol of their renewed connection to their ancestors, with each family contributing stitches that would bind their individual stories into a collective work of art. "Uncle Isaac," Ruth said, without looking up from her pattern pieces, "are you worried about today?" Isaac considered the question as he poured his coffee. "I'm concerned, little one, but I'm also grateful. Grateful that your great-great-grandfather Samuel was brave enough to preserve our history. Grateful that we found his gift in time to use it, and grateful that our community is strong enough to stand together when it matters." Sarah arrived early, carrying a large folder containing the documents they had selected as the most crucial evidence. She had spent the previous evening with Dr. Webb and Professor Miller, organizing the materials in the order that would most effectively tell their story. "Isaac," she said, setting down her burden with visible relief, "I've been thinking about what Samuel wrote in his letters, that he placed his faith in the next generation. I don't think he just meant you. I think he meant all of us." Bishop Miller arrived soon after, followed by the delegations from other Amish communities who had come to witness this crucial test of their shared heritage protection efforts. The barn filled with the quiet conversation of families who understood that their way of life might depend on the outcome of the morning's meeting. At precisely 10 o'clock, 3 black sedans pulled into the Stoltzfus farmyard. Isaac watched through the barn window as men in expensive suits emerged, carrying briefcases and tablet computers that seemed alien in the rural setting. The contrast between their polished appearance and the plain dress of the gathered Amish families highlighted the cultural divide they were attempting to bridge. The lead representative of Hartwell Development was a man named Charles Morrison, whose silver hair and confident bearing suggested decades of experience in negotiations where large sums of money were at stake. He was accompanied by 2 lawyers and a consultant who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Lawson, a specialist in historical document authentication. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting," Morrison began, his tone professionally courteous but carrying an undertone of skepticism. "We understand you have materials that you believe challenge our client's legal position regarding certain properties in this region." Bishop Miller stood to respond, his dignity evident despite the informal setting. "Mr. Morrison, we have documentation that establishes our family's continuous ownership of these lands for over 2 centuries. We hope that reviewing this evidence will help us avoid unnecessary legal conflict." Dr. Lawson stepped forward with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're certainly willing to examine whatever materials you have, though I should warn you that historical documents can be easily misinterpreted by non-specialists. Land ownership in colonial Pennsylvania was often poorly documented, and many claims that seem valid are actually legally questionable." It was Professor Miller who responded, his academic credentials lending weight to his words. "Dr. Lawson, I think you'll find that these materials have been authenticated through multiple sources and cross-referenced with official records from both American and European archives. We're not dealing with questionable colonial documentation. We're looking at comprehensive legal evidence that spans multiple jurisdictions and time periods." Isaac felt his pulse quicken as Dr. Webb began arranging the documents on a long table that had been set up for the presentation. Each piece of evidence represented years of Samuel's careful research and preservation work. The original land grants, the persecution documentation, the immigration records, the settlement maps. All of it had been organized to tell an unassailable story of legitimate ownership and legal protection. Morrison examined the first few documents with practiced efficiency, but Isaac noticed his expression beginning to change as he realized the scope and quality of the evidence before him. These weren't the scattered family papers he had obviously expected to find. "Where exactly did you obtain these materials?" Dr. Lawson asked, her professional skepticism beginning to show traces of genuine concern. Isaac stepped forward, feeling the eyes of his community upon him. "They were preserved by my grandfather, who spent 40 years documenting our family's legal rights and historical claims. He understood that our heritage needed protection from exactly the kind of challenges you're presenting today." The room fell silent as Morrison and his team began to grasp the implications of what they were seeing. The tension in the barn was palpable as Dr. Lawson examined document after document with increasing discomfort. What she had expected to be a routine review of questionable family papers was proving to be an encounter with the most comprehensive historical archive she had ever seen. "This covenant document," she said slowly, holding up the agreement signed by the original settlement families. "If this is authentic, it establishes collective ownership rights that would supersede individual property claims." Professor Miller nodded calmly. "It's been authenticated by 3 separate historical institutions. The signatures match known samples from each family's records, the paper and ink are consistent with the 1750s period, and the legal language reflects actual Pennsylvania colonial law." Morrison's lawyer, a sharp-faced man who had been taking notes furiously, looked up with obvious concern. "Mr. Morrison, if these collective ownership provisions are legally valid, they could affect properties throughout this entire region." It was then that Ruth made her contribution to the proceedings. She had been sitting quietly beside Isaac, but suddenly stood up with the Unity quilt pieces in her small hands. "Mr. Morrison," she said in her clear young voice, "would you like to see how our grandmothers made quilts together? Each family gave pieces, but they made one big quilt that belonged to everyone." Isaac started to redirect Ruth's attention, but Sarah caught his arm. "Let her show them," she whispered. "Sometimes children understand things better than adults." Ruth spread the quilt pattern pieces on the table next to the legal documents, arranging them carefully to show how individual contributions created a unified whole. "See, my piece, and Sarah's piece, and Mary's piece, they're all different, but they make something beautiful together." Morrison stared at the quilt pattern, and Isaac saw understanding dawn in his eyes. The child's simple demonstration had illustrated the legal principle that the documents established: individual families contributing to collective ownership, that created something stronger than the sum of its parts. Dr. Lawson was examining the original land deed with a magnifying glass, her expression growing increasingly grave. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "this document has been notarized by colonial authorities and recorded in the official Pennsylvania land records. I can see the registration markings and cross-references. This isn't just a family keepsake, it's a legal instrument that's been properly filed and maintained." "What are you saying?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already understood. "I'm saying that challenging these land titles would require overturning legal precedents that have been in place for over 2 centuries. The documentation here is more complete than anything in the official county records. In fact, some of these materials could be used to correct errors in the modern property databases." The final blow to Morrison's position came when Dr. Webb produced the Federal Heritage Protection Act documentation that Samuel had helped create. "Mr. Morrison, Your development company should also be aware that these communities are protected under federal law as historic religious settlements. Any attempt to challenge their land ownership or alter their agricultural character would require federal environmental and cultural impact studies. Morrison's shoulders sagged as he realized that what he had expected to be a simple land acquisition had become a legal nightmare. How long have these protections been in place? Since 1998, Professor Miller replied. They were established specifically to prevent the kind of development pressure your company has been applying to religious communities throughout this region. Isaac watched Morrison's team pack up their materials with obvious frustration. They had come expecting to intimidate a simple farming community with superior legal resources, only to discover that they were facing a sophisticated preservation effort backed by decades of careful planning and federal legal protections. "Mr. Beiler," Morrison said as he prepared to leave, "I want you to know that Hartwell Development will be withdrawing our challenges to land ownership in this region. We had no idea we were dealing with such well-documented historical claims." Bishop Miller stood to address Morrison's team. "Mr. Morrison, we appreciate your willingness to examine our evidence fairly. We hope this can be the beginning of respectful coexistence rather than continued conflict." As the development company's representatives drove away, the barn erupted in quiet celebration. Families that had been facing the potential loss of their ancestral lands now knew they were protected by Samuel's 40 years of careful work. But it was Ruth who provided the most fitting conclusion to the morning's drama. She approached the table where the legal documents were still spread out and carefully placed her quilt pieces among them. "Uncle Isaac," she said, with the wisdom that sometimes comes only from children, "I think Grandfather Samuel was like the people who saved the quilt pattern. He kept the pieces safe so we could make something beautiful together." Isaac looked around the barn at the faces of his community. Young and old, traditional and progressive, all united by their shared heritage and commitment to preserving a way of life for future generations. Samuel's gift had done more than protect their lands. It had brought them together as a community in ways they had never imagined possible. The cave that had seemed like a burden when Isaac first inherited it had become the foundation for a stronger, more connected community than they had ever known. The battle for their heritage was won, but Isaac understood that the real work, building on Samuel's legacy, was just beginning. 6 months after the confrontation with Hartwell Development, Isaac stood once again at the entrance to his grandfather's cave, but everything had changed. What had once been a hidden repository, known only to his family, was now the centerpiece of the Heritage Preservation Sanctuary, a place where Amish families from throughout the region came to study their history and protect their future. The cave itself had been carefully prepared for visitors while maintaining its sacred character. Solar-powered LED lights illuminated the chambers without disturbing the historical atmosphere, and climate-controlled display cases protected the most fragile documents while making them accessible for study. Most importantly, the site remained under community control, managed by a council of elders from participating settlements. Ruth, now 6 years old and even more confident in her role as unofficial guide, was leading a group of children from visiting families through the main chamber. Her small voice echoed off the limestone walls as she explained how their ancestors had preserved their most precious belongings for future generations to discover. "And this is where I found the pretty cross," she told the wide-eyed children, pointing to the spot where her curiosity had first unlocked their family's secrets. "Uncle Isaac says sometimes the most important things are hidden where only children think to look." Isaac watched his niece with pride and amazement. The fearless little girl who had wandered into a dark cave 6 months ago had become a bridge between generations, helping other children understand their connection to ancestors. They had never met, The heritage sanctuary had attracted attention far beyond their local community. Scholars from universities throughout the East Coast had visited to study the comprehensive collection of Anabaptist historical materials. Government officials had come to understand how the preservation model could be applied to other religious communities facing development pressure. Most importantly, Amish families had traveled from as far as Montana and Florida to contribute their own historical materials and learn from Samuel's preservation methods. Dr. Webb and Professor Miller had established a permanent research partnership with the community, spending 2 days each week at the site helping families organize and understand their historical materials. Their respectful approach and genuine care for Amish values had helped bridge the gap between academic scholarship and community preservation needs. "Isaac," Dr. Webb said as she joined him outside the cave entrance, "I wanted to share some exciting news with you. The National Archives has agreed to create digital copies of all the materials here, with the originals remaining in community control. This means your grandfather's work will be preserved permanently while staying where it belongs." Isaac nodded thoughtfully. It was exactly the kind of arrangement Samuel would have wanted: protection and accessibility without loss of community ownership. He would be pleased to know that his work will help preserve other communities' heritage as well. The most significant change, however, was in the community itself. The process of discovering and sharing their history had brought families closer together in unexpected ways. The Heritage Quilt Project had expanded into a community-wide effort, with each family contributing pieces that told their unique story, while creating a unified work of art that would hang in their new community center. Sarah had officially been appointed as the Heritage Sanctuary's educational coordinator, a position that allowed her to combine her teaching skills with her passion for historical preservation. Her work developing curriculum materials had attracted interest from Amish schools throughout the region, creating a network of educators committed to helping children understand their cultural heritage. "The most remarkable thing," Sarah told Isaac as they watched Ruth leading her tour group, "is how learning about our past has strengthened rather than threatened our faith. The children who participate in heritage education programs show deeper appreciation for our values and stronger commitment to our community." Bishop Miller, now in his mid-70s, but energized by the community's renewed sense of purpose, had become an advocate for heritage preservation throughout the broader Amish world. His transformation from skeptic to supporter had helped convince other church leaders that understanding their history could strengthen rather than undermine their faith traditions. "Isaac," the bishop said as he joined the group outside the cave, "I received word yesterday that 3 more communities have requested help establishing their own heritage preservation sites. Your grandfather's vision is spreading far beyond what any of us imagined." As the afternoon sun slanted through the oak trees, Isaac walked the perimeter of the property that had changed everything. The 20 acres Samuel had left him were now surrounded by additional land that neighboring families had donated to expand the heritage sanctuary. What had started as a forgotten inheritance had become the foundation for a preservation effort that was protecting Amish communities throughout America. Ruth came running toward him as her tour concluded, her face flushed with excitement and pride. "Uncle Isaac, one of the visiting children, asked me if I was sad that we had to share our special cave with other families. Do you know what I told her?" "What did you tell her, little one?" "I told her that sharing the cave made it more special, not less special. Because now lots of families can learn about their grandparents, just like we did." Isaac lifted Ruth into his arms and looked back at the cave entrance, thinking about the circular nature of their story. Samuel had left his community to protect its heritage, and his sacrifice had ultimately brought that community closer together than it had ever been before. In his pocket, Isaac carried Samuel's final letter, the one addressed to Ruth for when she came of age. He planned to give it to her on her 18th birthday, but he already knew its essential message, that understanding your heritage doesn't trap you in the past, but rather gives you the wisdom to shape your future. As they walked back toward the house where 5 generations of Beilers had lived and worked, Isaac reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A child's curiosity had unlocked secrets spanning centuries, revealing that their ancestors' greatest gift wasn't the land they had farmed or the faith they had preserved, but the courage they had shown in protecting both for future generations. The cave would continue to welcome visitors, scholars would continue to study the preserved materials, and children would continue to discover connections to ancestors they had never met. But most importantly, the community Samuel had died to. Protect would continue to thrive, strengthened by understanding where they had come from and confident in where they were going. As Ruth had said with the wisdom that sometimes comes only from children, sharing their heritage had made it more special, not less special. And Isaac knew that Samuel would be pleased.